Hello and welcome back to episode 18 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, a podcast where we're taking a look at the Walt Disney animated classics in chronological order to see which ones really hold up to that title of an animated classic. As always, my name is Liam and I'm joined by my very good friend Ben. Ben, what are we taking a look at this week?
This week, Liam, we are looking at 1973's Robin Hood, a film that has received mixed responses and reviews over the years, but for me personally, it's one of my most beloved of these films. What are your recollections of it?
Similar to you, this is a film that I watched endlessly as a child. This is one of about 5, which was on pretty much every week. That said, I hadn't watched it in many years, so I was interested to go back and see how it holds up.
Well, let's start as we always do then by going through the film's plot. And as is so often the case in Disney, we start with a storybook opening, this time The Tales of Robin Hood, and rather than the somewhat dry opening we've had at the start of a couple of other films, we instead get Alan Adale, a country singing rooster.
Immediately, I chuckled when the film started, the storybook opened, and Alan Adale interrupts and says, "You think you know the real story, but here's our version of events."
No, this is how it really happened. Historically, this is what happened. The bit where a rhino knocks down a tower, that happened in England.
What stands out straight away in this opening, and what the film is probably most known for, is the fact that all of the characters are represented by animal counterparts, and this is an Animal Kingdom retelling of the Robin Hood story. And I really enjoyed it. Throughout the credits, we get an introduction to the characters and their actors, but also the creature they are supposed to be, as if the animators just didn't have faith that we would recognise them immediately.
I mean, you joke about it, but I used to run a pub quiz a few years ago, and we did a Disney pub quiz once, and one of the questions, quite simply, was what animal is Friar Tuck?
That was going to be my first response is watching this. It was the first time I realised that Friar Tuck was a badger.
When we said that, which it clearly is, it's in the credits, I'm not exaggerating, people were shouting at each other. I told you! So yeah, can be a controversial issue.
Stories with anthropomorphic animals aren't anything new. Obviously, we've got the classic Beatrix Potter books, but they've always been more focused on the animal kingdom. Here, we actually have a very human story just being told with animals. And one thing that I think it nails immediately is the idea of we have certain associations with types of animals, and so the animators use that to represent the characters that they're portraying, i.e. Robin Hood is quite a sly and mischievous character, so you represent him with a fox. Quick aside, this is actually something I really like to do with English lessons. So if you happen to be a teacher listening to this, a really good activity I enjoy is after you are reviewing a piece of fiction, you present the Robin Hood challenge, where you get people to decide what character, where you get people to decide what animal would portray each character, and obviously get them to explain it.
That's a really fun idea. When I was reading up on this film, some of the animals changed. So at one point, they really wanted to make the Sheriff of Nottingham a goat.
I think a wolf works much better.
I do too. I know Ken Anderson wasn't happy with it, but the wolf is the better shout.
I even like to think of other Disney films, like, because this is the first one they did it. So either before or after, how would you recast the Disney films so that they're all played by anthropomorphic animals?
Well, if I was starting with Pinocchio and I had Jiminy the Little Green Man, I'd probably make him a cricket.
Geppetto would be a good goat.
Be a good go. Yeah. This opening, like several others of this era, it's quite lazy. It's basically just bits of animation from elsewhere in the film reused. The thing that really stands out for me is how rubbish the font is. So not the font in the book, I think that's absolutely fine. And the fonts they use elsewhere in the film for like wanted posters and things, again, I think it works. But it's just a very ugly, angular, yellow font that they use to announce the characters, and it just looks rubbish. This is a very petty gripe, I know, but...
No, I agree. The credits started and my first reaction was that this is a lot of fun, but then the credits kept going and they definitely overstayed their welcome.
We're in that weird middle ground where it's not just 3 or 4 title cards a la Dumbo and Bambi, etc. And we're not in the post-film credits of The Lion King, etc. So, yeah, they want to do something with the credits, but also just put them at the end. Don't worry about it. We'll definitely read them, I promise.
That said, I immediately bloody love Alan Adale.
Yeah, we open with this track called Whistle Stop, which is just him whistling and scatting over the opening credits, which sounds a lot worse than it actually is. It's very, very catchy. Generally, I think the sort of folky direction of the music in this film works really well. I think it works thematically, because obviously the idea is it's all folk music, i.e. music that people might have listened to at the time. Obviously, it sounds a bit more modern, but it's got its roots in that. And secondly, no other Disney film's really done a score like this. It doesn't sound like the choral singing of the early films. It's not trying to do jazz like a lot of the last few films have been doing. It's not like the Broadway numbers you get in the more modern Disney films. It genuinely feels quite unique.
For the most part, I would have to agree. However, maybe it's just my ear being tuned wrong. During all of the action sequences, the music felt very 70s rock and a bit out of place.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
Like, out of nowhere, there's clearly an electric guitar being used.
I mean, the folk sounds like 1970s folk as well. Don't get me wrong.
A film scored by Fleetwood Mac.
So we're introduced to all the animals, and then we get our opening number. We go straight into a second song after a little bit more information from Alan Dale about who he is. He's a minstrel. And we open on Robin and Little John, and we get the song Ooda Lally. And I've just written, if you want to get smashed, drink every time you hear Ooda Lally in this film.
Yeah, Ooda Lally is going to be stuck in my head for a long time. I really like this introduction to Robin Hood and Little John, where it's almost a pseudo montage just telling us everything we need to know about the characters just in the form of a song, which we haven't had in a very long time. And I mean, it helps that people know the story of Robin Hood. That said, does this film work if you're not familiar? Because I think this was probably my introduction to the legend of Robin Hood.
This is what actually happened, Liam. This is no legend. This is how it happened. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons those characterizations and use of animals work so well, is it works really well as a shorthand. But for me, and we'll come back to this later in the film, but I think this is a film where they absolutely nail the voice performances and the writing. Maybe in terms of structure, it's not perfect. I think every character just kind of comes to life quite well. I think Robin is a really good example of that. His voice could melt butter. And yeah, okay, it's Phil Harris again, who's basically just playing Baloo again as Little John. But I just feel they nail that camaraderie. It feels very genuine, the exchanges between them, and they feel like friends, and I just feel instantly drawn into that world of these two rogues getting into trouble in the forest.
One of my first notes is just that Robin Hood's voice is incredible. So Robin Hood is played by Brian Bedford.
Don't Google him, because it'll ruin the illusion of how sexy Robin Hood is.
And yeah, Little John is just Phil Harris for the third film in a row now, doing much of the same performance. But I feel this is the one he's having the most fun with. It's also the most believable relationship, as you say. Like, I never really bought how quickly Baloo and Mowgli hit it off. I completely bought that he was a sleazebag in the Aristocats, but that's completely different.
And I also think there's just a lot of funny lines in this film, like genuinely good, witty dialogue. Stuff that actually works as jokes, not just heavy-handed slapstick, etc. Just a lot of nice sort of back and forth dialogue. Even in this opening sequence, there's a bit where Robin kind of flicks an arrow at Little John and it pierces his hat, and he's like, hey, that's the only hat I've got. That's like a funny line. The delivery's funny. And also, yeah, that would be his only hat. They live in the forest. They don't have a home. Like, I don't know, it's great. It's not the only hat he's got, because he wears several other hats in this film.
I was going to say, there's a tree out there with all the various hats he wears throughout the film. Just a pseudo hat rack. You're right, a lot of my notes today are just lines that I enjoyed and wanted to make a note of. The first one being during this encounter where straight away Little John asks the question, are we the good guys or the bad guys? To which Robin Hood responds that he sees it as a service, like they're not stealing, they're just borrowing. Little John responds with, borrow, boy are we in debt. And I just think it's a nice little character moment. And you're right, the dialogue throughout the film is really top notch this time.
I think the reason it works is a lot of the jokes in the dialogue are for the other characters. They're making jokes to each other or making little comments to themselves about going, oh, this is the situation. It's not a case of a character saying something for our benefit. That does happen occasionally, but that's not the main drive of it. And yeah, there's the more slapsticky moments that are obviously aimed at sort of the younger audience. Ostensibly, these films are made for children, who knew? But I think the fact the characterization and the delivery of these lines is so good does give it a lot of appeal to people who are a bit older.
And so, having established our heroes, it's time to establish our villain. And you know me, I love my Disney villains, and I've got to say, Prince John is one of my favourites. He's not Hook levels, but I do really enjoy the character of Prince John, particularly as a foil against Robin Hood.
He's so good. Peter Ustinov is just loving this role. There's so much stuff he does that I don't think is even in the script. It's just this sort of little whining noises he makes. Like, it's genuinely really, really funny. Again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think my favourite Prince John line, of which there are many great lines, is Sir Hiss annoys him, so he goes to bop him on the head, and Sir Hiss dodges, and he goes, "You deliberately avoided that." That's really funny. Every scene between them is so good. Yeah, it's just genuinely very funny, but also like your perfect pantomime villain. He's evil, he's got loads of money, he's just a great villain.
Pantomime is definitely the right word, and they could have gone too far with it, but I think that instead of necessarily toning that down, they just decided to have him always in scenes with Sir Hiss, who is a lot more muted as the sort of the villain's sidekick. And he's still funny, but he's a lot straighter.
Ironic, because he's a snake.
I was wondering whether the original intention was to get Sterling Holloway for Sir Hiss, considering the character himself is just all of the footage of Car.
But a lot shorter. He's just a short Car. I have a lot of things to say about how great the voice acting in this film is, and maybe it's not a coincidence. This is one of the few from this era that doesn't have Sterling Holloway in.
Oh, it does have Piglet in.
It does have Piglet in. I'm fine with that. Do you know why? Because they haven't used Piglet in every bloody film.
I did enjoy when John Fiedler showed up, and I was like, oh, it's Piglet, sounding as terrified and pathetic as ever.
So Prince John is riding into Nottingham. Him and Sir Hiss are reflecting on how they've duped his brother King Richard into going on a pointless crusade.
You say duped. Specifically, they say that Sir Hiss hypnotised King Richard into the crusade, and I think that's a bit of a flippant dismissal of just how horrible the crusade was.
Also, they establish in this opening scene that Sir Hiss can hypnotise people and then never mention it again. There's definitely times in this film that ability would have been useful.
But my point is, I know that media has never been particularly fond of portraying British history in a negative light. But there are more than a fair few instances where Britain has had a really quite negative role on the world. And I think the Crusades is one of those. So to just dismiss it as the king was hypnotised and wash your hands of it.
I think you've really lowballed the description of England's effect on the world there. So, as they're heading into Nottingham and revelling in how much they're going to make from taxes there, Robin and Little John see their opportunity and disguise themselves as fortune tellers. So Hiss sees through them straight away, but Prince John, being the gullible fool he is, decides he wants to see them because it'll be droll, and they rob him for everything he's got.
I can't quite remember, but is there drag in the Kevin Costner version of Robin Hood?
I've not seen it. One thing I really genuinely like about this scene is basically the bad guys are undone because they're sexist. So Sir Hiss says they might be bandits and Prince John says, "Women? Bandits?" And then later on, when Little John's drilling into this treasure chest and stealing all the gold, one of the guards sees him and Little John's response is just kind of show off his thickness, and the guard just sort of wolf whistles at him. You know, if those two instances hadn't happened, they wouldn't have got robbed. So, you know, sexism doesn't pay.
You mentioned drilling into the chest with the dagger. The chest that is comically locked with about a dozen locks. And there's just something very satisfying about drilling in through the bottom with the dagger. And I wish more people would use that.
Yeah, it's a nice little play on it. I don't know how the guards don't notice Little John doing it, but I guess there's little workarounds that he's just putting on a bit of a show for them or whatever. And again, it sets up really nicely all their little tricksy approaches they use to get around the brute force that the Crown is showing. They have lots of tricky things that they do. I like how Robin, when he's telling Prince John's fortune, you know, you can see he's kind of trying to steal the money and things like that. And then when it cuts, he's also just got the king's robe on and he's just running away. That just happens off screen. It's great.
I realise this is 2 out of 3 films in which Phil Harris's character dresses up as a woman.
Yeah, he's really cornered the market in jazzy cross-dressing bears.
I enjoy as well that Robin puts on a voice and Little John just doesn't.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That happens later on as well. I guess it's just Phil Harris's approach to voice acting. He's like, nope. That's the voice I do.
You've paid for me, you're gonna get me.
This sets up something they continually use throughout the film. Robin has, like, I think 4 or 5 disguises throughout this film, so it's quite satisfying that this is established as their approach to solving problems and how they kind of get around things. I quite like that it's not just a one-off little thing and then they drop it straight away. They go, no, we're good at this. This is how we're going to approach it.
And so, Robin Hood and Little John, every time I say that, I want to break
Walking
into
through the
song.
forest.
Robin Hood and Little John.
Walking through the forest. Sorry.
Little John and Robin Hood. So the two bandits make their escape and are chased by the guards. They manage to get away, and due to stealing the hubcaps, the royal carriage sort of collapses, the wheels fall off, and Prince John is thrown into the mud. I have to say, I think I've Got a Dirty Thumb and then Cutting might be my favourite end to a scene we've had so far.
It's really good, and again, there's so many moments where he's just muttering to himself. It's like, oh, I've got a dirty thumb. I don't want this just to be us saying how much we love Prince John, but when he's having his fortune told, he's like, Sir Hiss, did you hear that? Oh, no, he's in the basket. And he's like, just like mumbling to himself. It's so funny.
After this, we cut to the town of Nottingham, which we can see has been completely oppressed by taxes. And at this point, I was wondering whether or not this film is libertarian propaganda.
Go on.
The overarching message just seems to be that taxes are bad, as opposed to, misuse and disproportionate taxes. It's very much just taxes, raise them, that's bad.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how rich you are, if there's no one growing food, your economy isn't working, right?
And it's at this point as well we're introduced to who is enforcing this and collecting the taxes, which is the Sheriff of Nottingham, played wonderfully by Pat Buttram.
Yeah, we mentioned him in the Aristocats, and his voice is instantly recognisable, but maybe it's just personal preference, but I think this is the role that suits that voice the best.
Yeah, he's a conniving and snivelling, takes great joy in enforcing this very strict and unfair taxes. Immediately in the scenes, they've managed to portray him in such a comically villainous way that obviously you hate him immediately. I think we see him take money from someone who is disabled, from a child, and a widow, all in the space of about 2 minutes.
He's going around collecting his daily taxes, and Robin's following him afterwards and giving people money to help them get by. And we get this scene of, it's this rabbit's birthday, and just as they're finishing singing Happy Birthday, the Sheriff of Nottingham bursts in and is like, Happy birthday to you, why don't you open your present? And it's a farthing, and the Sheriff of Nottingham takes it and says, oh, well, that's your contribution towards taxes. Now, how did the Sheriff know that there was a farthing in there? Because if he didn't, what was his plan B?
I assume he's just going to confiscate any toys, like a little toy train set. It's like, I'm sure Prince John will find a use for it.
We'll melt it down. One thing I really love is how depressing these lives are. I know it's obviously they would be peasants historically, so their lives would be very grim, but I really like how they depict that. They live in shacks, they've got no money, they're drinking soup, and it only gets worse as time goes on. Like, I like that you visually see what they're fighting for. I think that's always the best way in a visual medium to engage people and make them actually care about what's happening.
I think it's a fairly obvious point, but again, this is predominantly aimed at children, and I think it's a really good example of it, but the film employs pathetic fallacy really, really well, where the weather definitely reflects the state of the people who are in the scene. So when we're looking at the peasants, it's always overcast or raining, it's very dark and somber, but Robin Hood, Maid Marian, all of these scenes which are providing a glimmer of hope, you've got the nice sunny English countryside weather.
My only other note on this scene is clearly austerity doesn't work.
No, my last note on this is just that the giant family of rabbits always gives me anxiety. It's just such a horrible situation. And we've got this widowed rabbit with her 20 children. And they've all scrimped and saved for a farthing. And we just leave that and I'm like, oh, I guess things are going to be okay.
Well, the scene does end with Robin showing up and giving her some money. This is such a save the cat moment, but I also think it's just great for characterising Robin and also just making you care, because you see something which is quite upsetting, the Sheriff of Nottingham stealing from a little boy, and Robin turns up and gives him a bow and arrow, and then he gives him his hat as well. And it's nice because obviously that character wears that hat for the rest of the film, so it shows they care about it, but also the little jokey line about that's the only hat I've got is like, even the stuff Robin has nothing of, he gives away, which again, it just makes him likeable.
Doesn't he end up with another hat though as well?
Look, Liam, we're not here to pick holes in the film's plot.
I realise as well, we also see the Sheriff of Nottingham steal money from what he assumes is a blind beggar. All of the villains are just comically evil in this film, and it's great.
So Skippy the rabbit, whose birthday it was his 7th birthday, by the way. That's quite old for a rabbit. And his family, who are genuinely called Sis and Tagalong, his 2 sisters, they go out to try the bow and arrow out. Oh, and there's also a tortoise called Toby there. Now, this is one of my questions about this film, Liam. Going back to this, I was like, okay, I get it, right? So the animals of the people, the common folk, are all actual British animals. So you've got like a fox, you've got rabbits, dogs, chickens, that sort of thing. And then the animals of the crown are all the exotic animals, so your rhinos, your elephants, your crocodiles, etc. And also there's a tortoise that's a common folk. I don't get it.
I think they just really wanted to make slow tortoise jokes. They don't even make that many of them. I think there's one where he's cheering on his dad, and it's like, yay, dad. I do actually quite like that joke, though. Not to segue this back to British history, but on the note of exotic animals playing the royalty, why is England associated with lions? They're not native.
Liam, the Scottish national animal is the unicorn.
That's
You just get to pick what you want. Wales has a dragon.
Hey, that dragon was real until someone came along and killed it.
I can't really think of a more fitting thing for the patron saint of England to do than go and kill someone else's national animal.
So the children are out testing the bow and arrow. They fire too high and it ends up over the castle wall, and they're worried that they'll not be able to get the arrow back, which is not really a concern you should have about arrows. The point is that once you've fired them, they're usually lodged in someone's back, so you don't really want it back.
Yeah, but if you've only got one arrow, if you don't have that arrow, you've just got a bow.
If you've only got one arrow, you're not going to be a very effective archer.
To be fair, for a 7-year-old rabbit, it's a hell of a shot. Fires it further than I could. We've got some child voice actors here, Liam. On the Liam scale of child voice actors, where would you rate them?
On the whole, a couple of them are all right. I think the tortoise kind of makes up for it, because I think that's quite a good little performance. Like, it sounds like a tortoise. However, despite all of that, I think Tagalong brings the average right the way down, where this is clearly a 3-year-old that they just put a microphone in front of, and it doesn't work.
I mean, on the one hand, they sound like a 3-year-old, and they are a 3-year-old, but yeah, it just brings you out of the film a bit. But I do like the fact that we set up this little gang, but we don't get a full story with them. They're in the film, but it's not, oh, we're going to see Robin Hood through the eyes of these characters. No. We're going to see Robin Hood being Robin Hood because Robin Hood's awesome.
And so Skip breaks into the castle to retrieve the arrow.
Wait. You say he breaks into the castle. There's just a normal gate. It's just a normal metal gate that you use to get in.
On that note, actually, this world has animals of various different sizes, but it only seems to accommodate medium human-shaped animals. There are gates that are not going to stop the mice getting anywhere. The rhinos are not going to be able to even fit through them. There are creatures that can fly. Why do they even have walls? What I'm saying is, in terms of world building, it's no Zootopia.
Liam, you're just showing red to a bull there, and I'm not going to charge.
And so in the castle courtyard, we meet Maid Marian and her lady-in-waiting, Lady Cluck, playing badminton?
Yeah, there's a nice little visual thing here that I didn't pick up on until my most recent watching. Instead of a net, they've taken some tassels from the castle, presumably, to make a makeshift net, which obviously tells a bit of a story that Maid Marian doesn't really engage with that sort of side of things, which I think is quite nice.
One thing I immediately like in this scene is the voice performance for Lady Cluck by Carol Shelley, who I'm listening to this Scottish accent and immediately I'm like, yep, that's a chicken.
You're absolutely right. And again, I think there's so many instances where they've just nailed writing, performance and animation together perfectly. I think my only real criticism of Lady Cluck is you have to remember that her and Alan Dale are technically the same species. They do not look like they are at all.
And so we get a nice little sequence where Maid Marian notices the children and invites them in, and then the children very rudely pry about her love life and whether or not she's having children, which is not something you should do.
And it's alluded to that Marian and Robin were kind of childhood sweethearts and then they went their separate ways for a bit. And she points out that he carved their initials on a tree and it says RH and MM in a heart. Does that mean her name is Maid Marian?
hadn't noticed that. In fact, on that note, I believe it's mentioned that King Richard is Maid Marian's uncle. Now, does that mean that Maid Marian is Prince John's daughter, or that King Richard married a fox?
I mean, either way, she's part lion, right?
Yeah, this is what I'm thinking.
Maybe her mum was like, you know, a rabbit, and it's if you combine rabbit and lion, you get fox. I don't know.
It probably follows the Lady and the Tramp school of genetics. Boys are genetic copies of them dads. Girls are genetic copies of their mum.
So if Robin and Marion have children, some of them just might be lions if it skips a generation.
If it skips a generation. Or if she was cheating on him with a lion.
Don't ruin this for me, Liam. So one thing I really like about this scene is I just like the way Marion and Cluck interact with the children. They want to make them laugh, they tell them a little story, and they play around with them a bit. You know, Cluck pretends to be Prince John, and then Marion gets whisked off into the makeshift forest by Skip. And there's just a really nice moment where they're squatting behind these bushes, and Skip's just like, what do we do now? Because he's really naive. He's genuinely quite well written.
I mean, you've described that in quite a sweet way, but really what happens is a grown woman takes a child into the bushes and tries to kiss them.
I mean, sure, when you say it like that.
My goal today is to ruin this film for you.
Look, it's different if you're doing it to embarrass them in front of their friends. That's perfectly fine.
In front of their friends, hidden in the bushes. You're right, it is an incredibly sweet moment. And if you've ever interacted with young children, like you've had to play their games with them, it's exactly what you do anyway when you sort of enter their world. And in a way, you do end up teasing them without them really realising it. And it's all just quite sweet.
So we get a very quick scene of Marion and Cluck in her chambers. And it's very clear Marion's still thinking about Robin Hood. Very sweet touch as she's got a wanted poster for him stuck on the inside of her wardrobe, which is just really sweet. And then we cut across to Robin and Little John in the forest. Obviously, their surroundings a lot less decadent. And Robin's thoughts are also with Marion. So clearly there is a kindred connection there.
Yeah, I really like this contrast because, again, we've gone from the very wealthy and opulent tower to out in the forest. But again, if you're looking at the use of theming and the pathetic fallacy, they're both sunny and happy moments. I'm going a bit too lit student on us here, but I do like it. I think that it's a really nice scene comparing the two lifestyles. Like you say, they were close and they've taken different paths, but they still care about each other, and we get all of that information from a cut in a scene. It's great.
I think this film is really pacey. Every sequence lasts as long as it needs to and has something fun in it, which I think is quite rare in these films. Often there's scenes that are necessary for plot or to kind of move towards a certain sequence. Compared to the Aristocats, say, you're not like, oh great, it's the geese. So Robin and Little John are just kind of doing their housework, I guess. And Friar Tuck shows up and informs them that there is an archery contest to be held by Prince John, with the prize being a kiss from Maid Marian, which is a bit weird, but let's roll with it, I guess. Presumably she's agreed to that.
We've definitely gone down in tournament prizes from King of England to just a kiss.
And Robin's heart leaps and he decides he's going to enter and win because obviously he's the finest archer in the land. And he explains that he's got a little plan for how he's going to get past all the soldiers at the tournament.
Before we move on, one thing I really enjoy in this scene is that Friar Tuck shows up and just helps himself to the burnt food, and he clearly doesn't like it, but he just keeps eating it.
The scrounger is what he is. Scrounging badger.
Just a subtle dig at the church by Disney.
Gets a lot less subtle by Hunchback.
So yes, we have the tournament, and immediately at the introduction of the tournament, the parade from earlier in the film is just straight up reused.
Okay, so shall we talk about the elephant in the room here, which is, pun intended, which is the recycled animation we see throughout this film.
Yeah, this film could definitely just be called Recycled Animation, the movie, but I think it's okay.
The most egregious examples are definitely Little John and Baloo, and it's not helped by the fact Phil Harris is voicing them, but there's a lot of clips, particularly from the Aristocats and the Jungle Book, that get reused a lot. Later on, we even get a bit from Snow White, which is reused, which blows my mind that was the easier way of animating the sequence. But that's obviously how that style of animation is done.
So let's talk very briefly about rotoscoping, which was the main method used in this film, which, if you're not familiar, what they do is they will project existing footage onto paper, let's say, and then you can sketch over it using it as a guide. They've used rotoscoping in the past, but for live action references. So when they've had live action references, they would project it and then sketch over that to create the characters. Here, they're sketching over existing animation that they have. A lot of the times they are just copying it very closely, but they're not just reusing cells like I suspect was happening in 101 Dalmatians with the reused stuff from Lady and the Tramp. They are re-sketching character animations, but they're not having to concern themselves with the fluidity and the motion of the characters because they've already done that. So it is a lot easier. And I think it's pretty egregious with Little John and Sir Hiss. But the example you mentioned about Snow White being reused in the dance sequence with Maid Marian, I think that's actually a perfectly acceptable and quite clever use of rotoscoping to draw a completely different character, but with the same motion. I think it's a nice little shortcut. It saves money, and at least there's some creativity involved in it. There are moments in this film, though, that are just animation we've already seen. So in the case of the parade is just reused. There's a shot much later on which I really enjoy, which is two wolves firing arrows at each other, and one wolf fires the arrow and then it cuts to the other wolf who is also firing the arrow. The exact same sequence. The arrow hits just above the wolf and then it cuts back and the arrow hits just above the wolf, and it's the same animation just reversed, which I find those examples a bit harder to swallow than the rotoscoping.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to how it impacts on your watching of the film, because if you just know this and you're like, oh well, it makes the film look cheap, I think if you're watching the film in a vacuum, if this is the only Disney film you've seen, you're not going to go, oh wait, that looks a bit like that thing from the Aristocats, because you're not going to know that. But if it takes you out of the film as those examples do, and I think even someone who's only seen The Jungle Book once would very quickly recognise that they're reusing a lot of Baloo stuff, that does take you out of the film, and I do think that's a valid criticism.
We were talking about the contest, and I will just say this is one of my favourite sequences in the film. Two big reasons are, one, I love the disguise that Robin Hood chooses to wear, and two, Phil Harris is having way too much fun as Little John in this scene, and I think it's very endearing, it's very charming.
Yeah, so in the role of Baloo, Phil Harris said he threw a lot of the script out and just kind of made it a lot jazzier and in his own sort of dialect, and that just kind of stands out in the film, which I think is one of the reasons people love Baloo so much. Whereas in this film, Prince John is incredibly bemused by it. He finds it funny. He's like, oh, what a weird turn of phrase. The characters are acknowledging that he's talking in this unusual way, which I do think works really well. I also like just a really nice little visual thing is that in the first scene with Prince John, he smashes his mother's mirror over Sir Hiss's head. We see him and he's got a much smaller mirror to examine himself with. That's just like a nice little callback.
I hadn't noticed that, but you're absolutely right. It's a fraction of the size. What is it that Little John introduces himself as?
He calls himself Sir Reginald, Duke of Chutney.
Again, I very much doubt that was in the script. That feels like it's all Phil Harris. And as I say, most of this scene seems to be. I don't know whether they had him record first and they just got Peter Ustinov to come in and say, this is what the character's going to be saying to you. Have fun reacting to it.
So yeah, there's quite a lot going on in this little sequence. You've got the archery competition itself, which the Sheriff of Nottingham is hoping to win, and he's a fairly good archer, although he does do a little bit of cheating later on, and Robin Hood, disguised as a stork, is completely outclassing him, obviously. You've got this exchange between Prince John and Little John, and you've got Sir Hiss has been sent out by Prince John to see what's going on, basically, just to snoop around. And Hiss's immediate reaction is to try and asphyxiate himself by sticking his head in a balloon.
Yeah, I really enjoy the cartoon logic of Sir Hiss. There's the balloon over his head, which is a terrible message to put into a children's film. But he also has the little propeller tail, and it's just one of those nice little moments which I only think they're able to pull off because they made the switch to telling this story with animals as opposed to animated people.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the charm comes from in this film. I have just written medieval helium balloons, ?
I hadn't thought about that.
Because everything else is like, whilst it might have sort of cartoony logic, is more or less the technology of the time, except for the balloons.
The whole sequence, though, I think is exceptionally well done. Like you say, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of plates being balanced here, and it works really well.
I think my main criticism of this sequence and the sort of final climactic sequence is because of the way it's drawn, and this is a limitation of the animation of the time, but I find it's really hard to get a feel for the spatial relationship between things. It's not really clear where Prince John's sat in relation to where the archery is happening, in relation to where Sir Hiss is. It's just a bunch of disconnected sequences. I think the opening heist, it's very clear. To be honest, it's because it's on a linear road and all this animation happens on a 2D plane, but it can just feel a little jarring because stuff cuts and you're like, oh, that's over there, but then why didn't they see this? And yeah, it's not ideal.
That's a really good point, and I suspect that these sequences were handed to different animation teams, so they didn't necessarily know the references they were to have. I'm surprised actually it works so well without that spatial context. The archery contest has a line that made me double take, where Robin Hood says, I'm going to win the golden arrow and then present myself to the lovely maid Marian, and I think that wasn't the prize.
On a similar vein, my main note is, as Sir Hiss is snooping around, he goes behind Robin Hood, who's disguised as this stork, and looks kind of under his tunic and sees it's Robin Hood. But he just looks up from below, and in my head I go, it's Robin Hood. I'd know that arse anywhere.
It's similar to the Sheriff of Nottingham and the Present earlier, where it's a good job he was right, because if he was wrong... Yeah. No, just a normal stork, bum.
So, despite the Sheriff of Nottingham's best efforts to sabotage him, the stork, through an amazing feat of archery, wins the competition.
The trick shot that Robin Hood does is probably my favourite version of the classic splitting the arrow. So rather than just firing the arrow to split it, the Sheriff of Nottingham trips up Robin Hood as he's taking the shot, so he launches the arrow in the air, and very quickly Robin Hood fires another arrow to redirect the original one, and then that results in the split arrow, which obviously I'm not expecting to do things like that in the live action versions of Robin Hood, and as a result this is probably my favourite take on the trick shot.
And with that trick shot, Robin successfully wins the competition, but of course that's exactly what Prince John wanted, is he wanted to lure Robin out, and just as he's rewarding him, he cuts away his costume and reveals Robin Hood, who is immediately restrained and sentenced to death. Maid Marian pleads with Prince John that he be spared and declares a love for Robin, who reciprocates it, and Prince John responds by saying they should both be killed. But is thankfully saved when Little John puts a dagger to his back and threatens Prince John into releasing them. And then the Sheriff of Nottingham discovers this, they have a fight, and then basically all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, we very quickly descend into a chaotic Benny Hill-esque chase sequence involving some kind of rugby at one point. Though I actually imagine it was probably, I suppose the shorthand is they were going for American football. This is with Lady Cluck charging on the rhinos.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that sequence. And I'm not going to say this is the most astute or subversive film, but it might be the first time we see a female character in Disney be sort of physically competent against the bad guys, which is quite nice. You better savour it, because there's Mulan, and then that's about it.
Before we move on from the archery contest and the chaos that ensues, we would be remiss not to mention that we get an appearance by one of our old favourites. We've got Candy Candito shows up as the head of the guards, I think?
Yeah, he's the sort of announcer, isn't he, for the event?
That's the one. He's basically just doing his chief voice again, but when it's not attached to a horrifically racial stereotype as an animation, it works quite well.
Yeah, I think menacing crocodile suits that voice a lot better. I really like in the sequence as well that Robin and Marian are kind of making their small talk and catching up, and all the while they're just fighting off goons. Robin's spinning his sword around and they're falling through things, and she's saving him with a pie. Again, I like that there's action and characterization at the same time.
He proposes, doesn't he? And they start discussing wedding and honeymoon and children plans.
Marian says they're going to have at least 12 children. I was like, God, that's a lot. And I was like, well, they are foxes. They have litters, don't they? That's fine.
We'll have 12 children and 3 will survive.
Jesus. And on that note, we then jump to a completely different change in tone, and we get a non-diegetic piece of music, so music that isn't happening within the film itself, but rather over the top of it, and that is the incredibly generically named song, Love.
Yeah, I could take or leave this song. I think a big part of it is that it's non-diegetic.
I really like this sequence, certainly. I think the song's okay. It was Academy Award nominated, which blows my mind. But I think after all the chaos and dialogue, just having a visual display of their relationship and them walking through the forest together, I think is a really nice way of sincerely showing how these characters actually feel. You get all the bravado and banter beforehand, and then you just get to see these characters having a bit of time together. I think it's a really sweet moment.
We mentioned in the Sword and the Stone episode that Merlin was very much a proto-genie, and it was interesting considering the genie is this critically acclaimed character, and here we have basically all of the beats being hit but overlooked, maybe because of the film it's around. And watching this today, I was surprised how much this is just Can You Feel the Love Tonight?
Yeah, now you say it, you're absolutely right. And another Lion King parallel that stood out to me is you've got the big, brave, bold lion and the snivelling, cowardly, plotting younger brother lion who's trying to usurp his crown.
I mean, I love Scar, but I'd also love to see the Lion King if you just insert Prince John instead.
I think Mufasa would probably still be alive.
No, he would have got sent on a crusade.
Okay, it would have ended very badly for the hyenas, having a crusade against them.
So after Love, we go back to the sort of forest village where everyone is catching up away from the prying eyes of the law and the sheriff with his tax collecting, and everyone just gets together and has a party. This entire sequence is rotoscoped. There's very little in this sequence which is original animation, but that said, I don't mind because Phony King of England is a bop.
Yeah, it's really fun, and even though it's pretty much back-to-back with another song, I think it works really well. And again, there's a nice little visual right at the end of the song where it's kind of panning back. Robin's playing a violin with his bow, because obviously that's what you call the thing you play a violin with, but it's an actual bow. It's a nice little visual joke.
And to go back to effective cinematic storytelling, we immediately cut to the Sheriff of Nottingham cheerily singing the Phony King of England himself, which again immediately tells us that some time has passed. Everyone is kind of rebelling in a way where they're openly mocking the king, and it's spread even to the ranks of the king's men.
And when Prince John chastises him over it, the sheriff's response is, "It's a hit, everyone's singing it."
I'm just picturing Jasper and Horace singing that to Cruella in jail.
Singing Cruella de Vil, not Phony King of England, right? And we then jump forward to the consequences of this, and everything's really, really depressing. Everywhere is shutting down. Practically the whole town is in jail, including Alan and Dale. There's a nice little reveal of he's narrating it, and then it pans and he's actually in jail. And we get the song Not in Nottingham, which I think it does a really good job of being down and depressing. I think every song in this film provokes a different emotional reaction, and I think this is, perhaps out of any film, is my go-to things are at their lowest point song.
I was going to say, as far as film musicals go, this is probably the best example of an end of second act song.
The only other one I can think of is from the Magic Roundabout film, Dougal and the Blue Cat. There's a very depressing song they sing there where they think they're all doomed. But this is better.
And so we can see Friar Tuck with his assistant mice, I think they're probably the deacon and his wife, who are ringing the church bells. Even though no one can come to church because they're all in jail, he's at least hoping that the sound of the church bells will make them feel better, as opposed to just reminding them that they're all in jail and now they're going to hell for not attending church.
He's just rubbing it in, if anything. You're gonna come to church?
Free.
Oh wait,
I'm
you
free.
can't.
And so when the Sheriff of Nottingham shows up and takes taxes directly from the poor box, this is the last straw for Friar Tuck, and he goes ballistic. He starts attacking the Sheriff of Nottingham. Quite a well choreographed fight scene for an animation. There's a moment where you're like, oh my god, he might actually kill the Sheriff of Nottingham here.
And then you remember one's a wolf with a sword and one's a fat badger.
And yes, the wolf with a sword gets the upper hand and imprisons the fat badger, and Prince John sees this as an opportunity to lure Robin Hood out of hiding.
And this moves us into the last act of the film, a jailbreak, where Prince John and Robin are going to free everyone who's in jail and steal all the taxes back. And the way they're going to do this, first and foremost, is Robin's going to disguise himself as Nutsy the Vulture. We didn't mention Nutsy and Trigger. They're vultures, they've got crossbows, don't even worry about it. Again, this comes back to them using this approach of disguise and stealth to work their way into the castle.
Honestly, my only note on this is that the whole heist sequence is excellent.
It's really good. Little John goes to free the prisoners using his brute strength, and Robin climbs his way up to the royal tower, and they create, using a rope and an arrow, they create a little pulley system, and Robin ties all the money bags, which, by the way, I love that they're literal bags of money, and ferries them back to all the prisoners, who start moving out with them.
Not only are they literal bags of money, Prince John keeps them in his bedroom as opposed to a treasury or a vault.
It's great. It's so weird as well. Like, Sir Hiss has a little sleeping cap and he sleeps in a little, like, crib at the bottom of Prince John's bed. It's so weird.
I always forget about the little crib.
A lot of this scene, Prince John's kind of snoring or like muttering in his sleep, and there's one point Robin just looks down at him with like disgust. It's really good.
So in everyone escaping, there is an accident in which the alarm gets raised and the sleeping Sheriff of Nottingham is awoken, along with the guards, and suddenly it is a mad scramble to escape the castle and also to get the last bit of money away from Prince John and to the escaping prisoners. There's a really nice sequence where Robin Hood is traversing the rope pulley system with all the bags and he's getting shot at by all the guards. It's just a nice little bit of tension because pretty much from this moment, Robin Hood is just constantly in mortal peril for the rest of the film.
I love how they keep raising the stakes. Yeah, so he's doing that and then he has to swing round and he's trying to get everybody out and he does one of his like fancy trick shots to pin some guards. Again, they do a really good job of it feeling like there's genuine peril and danger, but obviously it's all very family friendly and there's, you know, no violence or anything. And Robin goes back to save Tagalong, but in the process gets stuck behind the portcullis. And yeah, the stakes just keep raising for him. He's having to like climb up places. There's spears getting thrown at him. There's arrows. People keep cutting off his escape routes. The Sheriff of Nottingham sets the tower on fire. I love the way it escalates. And the music builds to this crescendo where Robin has to dive from the very top of the castle all the way into the moat and then be pelted with arrows. It's fantastic.
I don't think it's a proper Disney climax unless everything's on fire.
Everything's on fire, you think the hero's dead, someone's fallen into a body of water, it's got it all going on.
And as you say, we have a moment where it looks like Robin Hood has been killed. We see Little John and Skip looking on, teary-eyed, before our reveal that Robin Hood has survived, much to the joy of Sir Hiss, which is quite a nice little moment.
Yeah, it's quite weird, but I think he's just as invested as we are in the situation.
And it's at this point that we hit the conclusion. We're told that King Richard returned. He broke out of his hypnotism, realised that ravaging the Holy Land is a terrible idea and is going to do centuries of damage.
You see, you're giving the narration far too much credit here. I think what Alan Dale says is, King Richard came back and, well, he just straightened everything out. Like, that's such a Deus Ex Machina. We're not going to show you it. We're just going to say, yeah, it's all fine now, don't worry.
One thing I enjoy in his process of straightening things out is over all the wanted posters of Robin Hood, he's put another poster up that says that he's been pardoned, as opposed to just taking the original posters down.
Yeah, Robin should have just done that in the first place. Just put pardoned up while he was still an outlaw. Also, presumably since they're all peasants, no one can read anyway, so it's irrelevant.
Another element of this straightening out that I quite enjoy is that Prince John, Sir Hiss and the Sheriff of Nottingham have all been imprisoned and condemned to work in the royal rock pile.
It does beg the question, was there a royal rock pile before? And we rush over to the church because we hear church bells and we see Robin Hood and Maid Marian walking out arm in arm. King Richard echoes the joke that Lady Cluck made earlier of having an outlaw for an in-law, and the way he says it makes me think he's said this joke 50 times today.
Yeah, maybe it's because it's the second time we're hearing it in the film, but you get the impression that everyone's just laughing out of politeness and fear because he's the king. Also, he's not an outlaw anymore. You've pardoned him.
Yeah, the joke doesn't even work, does it? I have a former outlaw for an in-law. Just not the same, is it?
I wonder if he really weighed up pardoning him, because he was like, if I pardon him, I won't be able to make the joke. And he was like, no, I'm the king. I'll still make the joke. People will have to laugh.
And we get one last errant arrow flying around from Trigger's crossbow, which lands in the heart of the just married on the back of Robin and Maid Marian's coach, and they ride off into the sunset. We're told that's how it really happened, and we get a little reprise of both love and Ooh Lally, and the film closes.
So Ben, I think it's fairly clear that you're quite fond of this film and have a lot of nostalgia and warmth for it, but how do you think it holds up as a piece of cinema?
There's no such thing as watching any of these films objectively, least of all if they're ones you grew up with. But I feel, having watched a lot of the other ones that I watched a lot as a child, particularly The Aristocats, Lady and the Tramp, 101 Dalmatians, Cinderella, I feel I've got a fairly good grasp of being able to judge them on their own merits. Rewatching this film, my memory of it going in was that this is a film that has excellent characters, has a really fun setting, and it's the structure that holds it back. But actually rewatching it, I think it's really pacey. I think each scene is interesting, and the plot is pretty basic, but it does keep moving forward. I often criticise films for there not really being character arcs, and granted, there isn't really a character arc in this. Robin and Marian, I guess you could say they kind of own up to their feelings a bit, but really, that's not what this film is about. I just have an incredible time whenever I watch it.
Coming up to doing this film, I often thought that it fell into the similar narrative structure as The Sword in the Stone, where it's just a series of events that don't really follow an overarching narrative. But watching it again today, there's a pretty clear escalation from scene to scene. We establish our hero and the setting in Nottingham. The inciting incident is that Prince John is arriving in Nottingham. Every action Prince John takes is always in reaction to what Robin Hood has just done to him, eventually culminating in the final desperate act of imprisoning everyone, including Friar Tuck, all in response to the actions of Robin Hood. So I think actually it does follow quite a good narrative. And then on top of that, you're absolutely right. The characters are probably the strongest characters we've had really since some of the earlier films.
And I think the consistency of those characters, I think in films from the 40s, 50s and even 60s, maybe with the exception of The Jungle Book, which I think does have quite a wide cast of characters, I think those earlier films, a character like Lady Cluck probably wouldn't be very interesting. She doesn't do much in the film, she doesn't really change the plot, but she's very memorable. And again, I think a huge amount of that is down to performance and writing. Not a lot of other Disney films nail it to that degree.
And to reiterate a point I mentioned earlier, the anthropomorphized animals really does contribute towards that. One, it might help in the writing process. It gives the writers a starting point, same for the voice actors, but also as an audience, there's a lot of preconceptions that we bring towards animals and we are projecting a lot. So I think that really helps flesh out those characters a bit more. I think Skip is probably the strongest child character we've had that's not a main character. Obviously, I think Mowgli is going to be hard to beat as a character, but for just a side character who is just an incidental child, compare him to the likes of Roly and Lucky in 101 Dalmatians, and it's just a world of difference.
So before we give the final judgment on Robin Hood, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding this film?
There is one thing, and I think in no small part this is definitely one of those films that inspired this segment, but we definitely have to decide who we think the sexiest character in Robin Hood is. Now, before I ask the question, I am worried this may descend into a conversation about our own preferred fursona. But, Ben, who is the sexiest character in Robin Hood?
Liam, if you asked me who the sexiest character is in Robin Hood, if you asked me who the sexiest character in any Disney film was, arguably if you asked me who the sexiest character ever was, I'd go with Robin Hood. And I am distinctly anti-furry. It creeps the hell out of me. But my God, it's the voice, it's the charm, just the whole package. So much so that on the Wikipedia Wikipedia page for this film, the two criticisms levelled against it are its recycling of animation and the sex appeal of the two main characters. And it specifically mentions that it contributed to furry culture. That's how sexy this fox is. But I think the other side of it is him and Maid Marian, they're not sexualized. Like, I think they're romanticized. You get a lot of close shots of them looking into each other's eyes and looking at each other romantically, but I don't think they're sexualized characters. But yeah, it's Robin Hood every day of the week. Ooda lally.
Now, I'm definitely not anti-furry. Like, it's not my thing, but I get it. And I tried doing some research before this, and it really does seem to be that this film is very much the genesis of that subculture. It evolved sort of throughout the 70s and 80s, but obviously anthropomorphic animals had existed before this. As I say, the Beatrix Potter books, but they never created furrydom. But I think you're right. I think it all just comes down to just how incredibly sexy Robin Hood is. And I think it says a lot that the most prolific fursona is a red fox. Often some wolves as well. I guess a lot of people really liked the Sheriff of Nottingham. I think there is just something inherently sexy about foxes. That sounds strange.
Yes, it does, but it's fine.
But when you take that and you put the character that we get of Robin Hood and that voice, all of it together, it's this holy trinity of sexiness that I think you're right. This isn't just the sexiest character in this film. This is one of the sexiest characters in Disney. I won't go as far as saying in all films or ever, but definitely in Disney.
If we ever do have the sexy character showdown at the end of these podcasts, I have a feeling it's going to be Robin Hood versus Daisy Duck.
I mean, I'm sure we both get our own choice of number one, just to not fall out over that. And with that, we just have to decide whether or not we think Robin Hood deserves a place on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics.
So I've preemptively got to the vault and readied the list and eagerly push it into Liam's reluctant hands. I think the most important response, Liam, is, do you think it makes it onto the list?
Well, it looks like you've already written it, so I'm not sure I get much of a say. Going into this, I knew you would want to put it on the list, and before rewatching it, I was not too sure. I think watching it again, narratively, it is very strong. The characters are, as I would say, some of the strongest we've had in a very long time. I think I can forgive the cheap shortcuts they took in the animation because all of those just support the characters and the story. So I think I want to put it on the list as well.
I didn't want to strong arm you into it because I genuinely wanted to know where you fell on it. Because not everyone loves this film. Some people think it's just a bit mediocre. I've already gushed about how I love the characters. I think the writing's fantastic, the performances are so good. The cheapness, it does hold it back a little bit, but I wouldn't want it any other way. On a side note, one of the reasons given for it being so cheap is production fell behind because they were spending so long trying to cast Robin Hood. So I think it's worth the trade-off of, oh, that looks a bit like it's from the Jungle Book versus sexiest character ever. I think it's a film that will genuinely get a lot of emotional reactions out of people. I think it's very fun. It's one of the funniest Disney films. I think you get genuinely emotionally invested in what's going on a personal level between characters, but also on a social level in terms of the poverty that's affecting this town. Obviously, it's just a light and fun film. I'm not going to say it's got a huge amount of depth to it, but if you told me right now, do you want to watch it again? My answer would be yes. I have talked so much in this podcast. This might be the longest one we've done, and I genuinely am leaving it feeling like I really held back and didn't say as much as I planned to.
You're right. Similar to what you said about The Lady and Tramp and 101 Dalmatians, this is very much a film with a young audience in mind. But whereas it was a weakness in those films where it felt, I don't want to say patronizing, but it felt like they didn't have much to say to those audiences, here it's one of the strengths. I go back to my classic 4-year-old test. This is a film where if I have a 4-year-old that wants to watch this every Saturday for 6 months, I'm going to be sat down watching it with them.
I'm going to be coming round.
And talking of films predominantly aimed at 4-year-olds, what are we going to be taking a look at next week, Ben?
Next week, we're looking at the first of 2 films that came out in 1977. This one is The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh.
You mentioned not wanting to strong-arm me this week, so I think I'll return the favour next week.
But of course, these are just our opinions. Maybe you think Robin Hood isn't as amazing as I'm saying it is. You're wrong, but you're welcome to say that you disagree with me. And please do let us know what you think and who else is very sexy in this film as well as Robin Hood. Again, I'm not going to open discussion as to who you think the sexiest character is. I'm telling you it's Robin Hood.
Really, coming second to Robin Hood is still a pretty great achievement.
That's basically first.
And with that, that is everything we have to say about Robin Hood. Be sure to join us next time when we discuss the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh.
Ooda golly, what a day. I won't put that in, I just wanted to say it.
Ooda lally, golly, what a day.